Hello, American Prestige viewers. It's Derek. I'm joined as always by my friend and comrade Danny Bessner. We're here on the YouTube with returning champion Harrison Mann.
Our
Harrison,
YouTube co-host,
our
apparently,
YouTube, yeah, our YouTube
who's been on
co-host these
5,000 of
days.
our YouTube
Um,
episodes.
Harrison is, as you know, he's a columnist at Sateo. He's former U.S. Army major and executive officer in the Defense Intelligence Agency's Middle East and Africa Regional Center. He resigned in protest of his office's support for Israel's war in Gaza under the Biden administration. And we're here to talk about some of the leading lights of the Biden administration. Harrison, thank you for coming back on the program.
Thanks for having me back.
So the column here is Biden's genocide squad must be stopped before they strike again, and this is a theme that Danny and I have talked about over and over
Ad
again on the
infinitum.
show. Not just about these guys, but in general the level of impunity that exists in the U.S. foreign policy arena. So why don't you just talk about the genesis for the piece, because I think that is enough to sort of explain what we're talking about here.
So this has been something that was kicking around in my head for a while, and I think also a lot of other people who either served in the last administration in some capacity or just care about U.S. foreign policy, particularly Gaza. But it's basically, there's a whole cadre of Biden appointees. Some are more famous, like Jake Sullivan and Brett McGurk. Some are lesser known, who, basically immediately after they left office had an opportunity to come clean or to say, well, you know what we did wasn't great, or to otherwise basically use their station to do something meaningful. Back then about Gaza, now I'd say about Gaza and Iran, and instead have been on self promotion tours to varying degrees since they left the Biden administration. And as I mentioned in the article, we have Jake Sullivan and Brett McGurk on Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert. I guess rest in peace for the latter. And then you have some of the lesser names still commenting in a lot of what I'd call industry publications, foreign affairs magazines, going on council and foreign relations panels. Almost all of them have some sort of university gig at Ivy League or very prestigious schools. And I think the main reason that this is really was really angering to me was like, this is part of pretending basically that either Gaza never happened or that it's something that we don't really need to care about. And if you wanted the genocide in Gaza to mean something beyond being another, basically another oopsie in US foreign policy, then you would need to treat the people behind it differently than we treated the people behind Iraq or Libya or you name it. And so I think I was just really kind of disgusted and like shocked, and this was quite naive, I realize, at how so many of these folks uh, basically are not only are going out and trying to pretend that basically nothing unusual happened while they were helping manage and sustain the genocide under Biden, but how they are allowed to do that and nobody else in DC or in universities or in media is really willing to push back on that.
The degree to which these guys have all landed on their feet, I mean, it's in keeping with what we've seen from both parties in the past. So
Yes.
maybe it makes sense to talk about this in context, and it's a cross party thing. It's also a bipartisan thing in the sense that Republicans recycle the same ghouls who do the same,
Mhm.
same shit. But even when there's an opportunity to hold people accountable, as there was in, and I'm going to sound like a broken record here again, as there was in 2009 to hold people accountable for committing torture, for lying the country into a war with Iraq, uh, the decision by the Democrats not to do that creates or enhances this sense of impunity, I think. Can you sort of talk about how that world functions, be across party boundaries, and sort of in terms of just the general, like, once you're in the club, you're in the club, and nobody's gonna give you any trouble.
Yeah, I think I maybe to you and to your listeners, this might be quite obvious. I think to me, at some point in my life, it was a little bit surprising, but understandably, uh, this kind of political class will put its own interests before the interests of its victims overseas, or its victims in the U.S., which I would count us and the American taxpayer among the victims, right? If you are lied to repeatedly and against your will, basically having your money spent to slaughter people overseas, we're the victims of that too. And I think I would almost now, I think I'm qualified to call it like a code of silence amongst the offenders. And I didn't put this in my article because I thought it would be distracting, but the accountability and sort of in-group solidarity obviously extends way beyond foreign policy. We are seeing the result of another crisis of accountability in U.S. politics right now, right? Whether you January 6th, Epstein, we had 3 presidential elections against Donald Trump where the Democrats didn't want to bring up Epstein. I mean, it's the same fundamental idea of basically thinking it would be more disruptive to hold the offenders to account, um, and that you have more in common with the offenders than the victims. And when we talk about foreign policy in DC, I think one figure who gets a lot of attention rightly and who's quite illustrative of this is Brett McGurk. And so uh, under Biden, he was the top Middle East official at the NSC, and he was basically one of the 4 or 5 guys leading the Middle East policy. You talked about Democrats and Republicans recycling the same people. He's really special because he's been just handed back and forth between Democrats and Republicans since the Bush administration, and has served nearly continuously. And so, what's extraordinary about him is not just that he, because of the continuity in policy, that he got to basically serve in every administration of both parties, ending in an extremely powerful position under Biden, but that if you read the like 3 or 4 profiles that have been written about him, nobody will talk about him on the record. Nobody will talk about him on the record. Even now, where he's sort of, at least in like DC Dem foreign policy, known as a guy who people don't like. And I've experienced this personally. People are afraid to speak out against him because they still worry that he's important enough, that he can torpedo your career, that he's still popular enough amongst some members of Congress or amongst donors, that he is still untouchable. And I think that, even more than kind of uncreative administrations hiring the same guy over and over again, um, is troubling, and is like the thing that I'm trying to get us away from.
So I've got a question about that. You always hear DC people, they're like Hollywood people. Everyone's so afraid of these careers.
Yeah,
Is that true? Like, could someone torpedo your career? And also what career? So you're
yeah.
a
That's
foreign policy establishment person. What are specifically are we talking about here? Being like Jake Sullivan's fifth in command?
Yeah, that's a great question. Something worth explaining. And I can't believe you resisted saying DC is Hollywood for ugly people, which is uh, I
Also
won't.
sweaty. Everyone's so sweaty in DC over the summer. I mean, it is very hot. You can't fault them for that.
So basically, there's like two ways. One I think is stronger than the other to kind of like ascend to influence in policy or in foreign policy, and it's usually you start out young. You might start out in an agency, but better yet, you're on the staff of a member of Congress, and then that eventually brings you into a presidential campaign, or an appointment job when a president from your party wins. And once you're kind of in there, you become a known quantity, and every time that your party is back in power, um, you get appointed to a position, ideally of greater and greater responsibility. In the interim, you either go back to the Hill, or you work for basically a Dem-aligned think tank like Center for American Progress, or you just work in some form of lobbying, though often under another name, where you and your buddies from the last administration use your connections, yeah, to lobby until the White House is open to you again. And so that's a fully relationships based system. It's a networking based system, and it means, right, because there's not really a formal trajectory, you are of course at the mercy of people higher in the food chain who can tell folks not to hire you, right? So that's the Hollywood comparison. And then on the other side, it's worth mentioning people who are career bureaucrats in places like State Department, DOD, and those folks. Most of them do not end up in a appointed policy position, but I just want to mention them as well because climbing those ranks also, of course, encourages nonconformity because then you can really just get fired for screwing up, right? That's in that case you're 15, 20 years in, your health insurance, your retirement, your entire life is tied to this. So if you're a career bureaucrat and you also get asked to do something untoward, it's also an extremely difficult and costly decision, and career ending to disobey an order. But yeah, that's the circle that I'm talking about. And so at no point in this chain are you rewarded for being a particularly rebellious or independent thinker. It doesn't mean that a lot of people involved in this don't have in their heart good principles or good ideas. But let's set aside Israel Palestine. You're not going to get that far, or you weren't going to get that far if you were famous as somebody who thought everybody was wrong about China and that maybe China threat inflation was overblown. You're certainly not going to get a job lobbying or working at Raytheon in between administrations if you do that. And you certainly weren't going to get hired by somebody like Jake Sullivan if you believe that. And so it encourages, beyond a team player mentality, a little bit of conformity of opinion. And Danny, as you pointed out originally, it is extremely precarious, and people understand that.
Especially now as white collar work kind of goes away, there's
Yeah.
also fewer places to go. So you're going to see even more pressures to the conformity. I am curious. I mean, I think AI is going to affect a lot of white collar work. I haven't really thought through how it might affect the foreign policy establishment. I mean, but talk about the encouraging of groupthink, an AI which reduces itself to the
Skynet.
median. Yeah. Yeah. Skynet has become self aware. Sorry, Derek. I know you're about to jump in.
Well, it's not a system that rewards competence, right? I mean, over kind of blindly following orders. And I point to the example of McGurk, who is like in a different category almost to me from the Sullivans and the John Feiners, who are like political guys. They're chummy with Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton or whoever the big shots who are calling the foreign policy shots in the Democratic Party. But McGurk just survives from party to party, from administration to administration, despite being having been a senior Middle East advisor to four presidential administrations in a row who carried out some of the dumbest Middle East policy that the United States has ever carried out, and he had a hand in all of it. And he just sticks around, and you get the appointment at CNN as a talking head kind of just emerges from like, I mean, CNN doesn't care. Like, this guy had a big job in the last administration. Let's put him on TV. Like, people know who he is, and he's connected, and that's enough. But like, to keep getting promoted up the ladder, even, I mean, to keep getting more and more important jobs despite demonstrating your incompetence is it really suggests a system where you're much better off just putting your head down and doing what people say than piping up when those people are wrong, or when you think something could be done better, because that's not rewarded.
And I would add to that you say Brett McGurk repeatedly demonstrated incompetence because he had key roles in failed U.S. policies. But I think the other way to look at this is, well, that's not the metric for competence. He was actually extremely competent as a bureaucrat, as a member of agencies, as a member of White House staff, and on in those capacities, I'm sure he did those jobs better than I could ever do. Um, And the things that you say he failed at, well, those, I mean, who calls that a failure? We do, because we have a sort of moral and historical sense. But think about who hired him. Other guys who also screwed up Iraq, right? He wasn't getting hired by us. He was getting hired by more senior people who had a he's getting hired uh, by folks who even if they saw like, okay, that policy was a screw up, Brett McGurk did a great job in it. And so I think there's like the larger issue there, right? There's if you kill a whole bunch of people in the Middle East, uh, but you're a great guy and you're really good in meetings, um, you're actually quite competent at your job. And like, yeah, I mean, I think that's the larger issue, is that if there is no common agreement, like there's like a broad agreement, right? Okay, Iraq was a screw up, Afghanistan was a screw up, kind of in aggregate, uh, but looking deeper into that, beyond like, okay, George Bush was bad, to, well, here's a whole other series of officials and generals who basically lied repeatedly or bungled their missions repeatedly. I don't feel like we've ever gotten to that level, and so somebody like Brett McGurk wouldn't necessarily be seen as a failure, even by people who, yeah, even by the people who are giving the on background only quotes against him in all of these profiles. And
S-
oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, so I'm curious with this, beyond McGurk, just with people
Yeah.
like Sullivan and Blinken.
Yeah.
Um, so we don't know what this Democratic autopsy really said. I haven't really looked into it, but it seems like there was some chatter about some parts being redacted or not released to the public about Gaza. I don't really know, but there were rumors beforehand that the autopsy suggested that Gaza and Palestine policy was critical, and it seems like very little or nothing was said about that in the released autopsy. Again, I haven't looked into it. That's my understanding. Apologies if I'm incorrect. But after Vietnam, like, some people really did not re-enter the establishment. I always use the example of Walt Whitman Rostow, who was a very high-level policymaker during Vietnam, who wasn't even before the war. He was at MIT. Then he had to go to UT Austin, and he actually wasn't welcomed back into the foreign policy establishment. Then you have examples like Henry Kissinger, who was kind of the doyen of foreign policy for decades. Where do you see this going with the Sullivan and a Blinken? Because I think you've seen a little bit of pushback, actually, from my sense, that Gaza is just viewed to be like a step too far. But am I incorrect? I'm not plugged into these circles. I'm,
Yeah.
thank the Lord, not in DC. What have you actually been seeing with Biden administration people?
So there's a few layers here. Like, first, right, when we're talking about, like, the big risk here is, right, is assuming that we have something approximating a fair election in 2028, a Democrat wins, brings all these folks back in, and they basically repeat their crimes. So I think if AOC or somebody very progressive is president or is running, we don't have to worry about them hiring these guys. But like Gavin Newsom, Pete Buttigieg, he may be DOA, but Josh Shapiro, or Kamala Harris appears to continually saying that she's going to run again, which sounds like a joke until it isn't. Right? That's who you would worry about rehiring these folks, because it's kind of who they know, or who their donors know, or who their friends in Congress know. And so that's why I'm very cautious about the take. Um, so my article came out a day after an article by, I'm going to mispronounce her name, Julia Iaffe, who also wrote about Blinken and McGurk and Sullivan and John Feiner, who was Sullivan's deputy, and said these guys are canceled and that they don't know it yet. I think that's great if that's true. I think given what the Democratic stable looks like, it's way too early to be confident in that. And then there's the issue of like the slightly less famous names, but who folks who served in government or got very involved in Palestine politics know. So, like, right, John Feiner, Sullivan's deputy. You have Phil Gordon, who was the top national security advisor for Kamala Harris. Some other people who worked for her who didn't necessarily get profiles written about them, but have otherwise, I think, demonstrated that they are not prepared for ethical decision making if they return to power. And like those are the folks that you have to worry about, I'd say, a little more, because you know voters or activists who care passionately about Palestine might not know who they are, and it's basically easier to slip them in, and they're already here off the shelf. And so, how far down the chain of command you want to go, I think, is something that's up for debate. But there's definitely folks who are not household names, who are two or three echelons down, who also, I think, behaved quite badly during this period, and basically took also a partisan and lawless and untruthful approach to their work around Israel. And so, the goal here, the goal of writing this article, and I think you're going to see more public, you're going to see other organizations take this on. They haven't released it yet. Is like basically the same way that APAC Tracker puts the amount of money that a politician got from APAC under their tweets or otherwise ties it to them, so they can't run away from that. The same thing is going to happen to candidates or other folks in politics who try to take on or consult with both the higher and kind of mid level agents of the genocide under the Biden administration. So that it's much harder to run away from. There was a somebody sent me a couple months ago. There was a guy running for Congress in California, a Democrat and a former Biden appointee, who was doing a campaign event, and the flyer for it, the digital flyer, had a big picture of Jake Sullivan's face, like he was the featured guest. And I was like, well, this is you should not be using Jake Sullivan as an advertisement, right? If that's the case, that means there's a lot of work to do, and it does not mean that we can write him off as somebody who continues to participate in our politics. And so, of course, I did what I could to share that broadly, and some of the folks at the event found out in a good way. I got off on a tangent there, but like, yeah, the bottom line is, like, it is far too soon to assume that these folks are persona non grata and will not be back in.
So just very quickly on that. So there's the political element, which is like who is elected,
Yeah,
but there's also like the literal establishment itself.
yeah,
And so over time, you imagine that this establishment gets younger, and we know that there's divisions on this policy. So just before, Derek, before we get to your question, Harrison, I was just wondering, like in the ranks,
yeah.
what are people saying? Because like people in the ranks could actually do a lot. If you like think Jake Sullivan is a war criminal, you're going to act differently than if you think he is not a war criminal. And so I'm just curious if you have any, if you have your pulse to the young Gen Zers who are the actual staffers of these bodies.
I'm confident saying, the majority or a strong plurality share my views about Biden's foreign policy, share my views about Israel and Gaza, and ideally would not have folks who have blood on their hands leading our foreign policy. And that was true on October 20th, right? That was true 2023, 2024. I know, because I know these folks. I worked with some of them. Plenty of people did not want to be executing support for the genocide, and they did it anyway because they were much more afraid of what would happen if they spoke out about that versus if they continued to help break the law and slaughter people. And so, um, that the good news is we have a lot of folks in this city and in this country who are capable of taking the reins and capable are ready to act, with morality. Um, but I think what hasn't changed dramatically is the courage or the confidence to still challenge, the most powerful voices.
This, I mean, I think this is really important, and it gets back to the issue of, who's got their levers on people's careers, or who's got the button that can, eject you from having a career in this stuff, and it also gets at the issue of the candidates who are running for office, like you started to go through the list of possible 2028 contenders, and it just occurred to me, like, AOC, in the, I think, unlikely event that she got nominated, I don't think she would tap necessarily the Sullivan, Blinken well of the party establishment. But most of these other candidates, Gavin Newsom, Andy Bashir, Josh Shapiro, any of the governors really, and then you can look at, I don't even know who else, out of Congress would be a contender at that point, but like, it ranges from people who are either in that wing of the party and fully support, or if you got them to take truth serum, would say they were supportive of pretty much everything that happened in Gaza,
Mhm.
to people who just don't know and don't care. Like, I don't think Gavin Newsom gives a shit who runs his foreign policy, as long as they don't make it an issue for him. And he knows, a guy like Blinken or a guy like Sullivan, like, these are big names. These are the people who've been there before. So I'll just hire one of them. What do I care? Like, that's the problem. And then that gives Sullivan or Blinken or any of these people, a level of control over these junior folks who may know better but want to have a job and don't really know what to do. So it really comes down to, I think, again, just the lack of salience that foreign policy has directly, on the political process in this country, that factors in here and just keeps the same people coming back over and over again, because the candidates don't care.
Yeah, I think so. I'm willing to say, I think Gaza is a little different, at least for one subset of the electorate, and especially look, if the Iran war's not over, the great chance that we're still going to be in some sort of Israel-related military conflict uh, by the time we get to campaign season, right? And so I think the fundamental question of like, is this person good on Israel Palestine? What good means, there's a lot of folks trying to stretch that definition. Is this candidate good on Israel Palestine? Is going to be a huge sticking point, right? Gavin Newsom realizes that, which is why he's taken 4 or 5 different positions about Gaza and Israel in the past couple of
Yeah,
months.
if you don't like the one he has now, just wait a couple of weeks. He'll have
that's
another one.
that's not going away. And I think the last time I talked to y'all, we were talking about how, what's the difference between saying we're going to stop paying for weapons for Israel and we're going to stop sending weapons to Israel. And one of these means you're kind of doing the bare minimum to get voters off your back. One of them means you actually want to change U.S. policy. I think the staffing is going to become like that. It's going to become another way to tell if a politician who's trying to get voters angry about Gaza off their back, to figure out like, hey, is this person actually serious about changing U.S. Israel policy, or are they doing the bare minimum? And you can tell if they're not serious if they're hiring back all of the folks who did Gaza under Biden. And so I mean, I suspect this is not what me or my organization are gonna do, but I think you're gonna see something related to this, like in candidate pledges or like endorsement checklists, coming in to 2028. Like, are you committing to not rehire or consult with this list of people? And I think it's going to become, as basically as pro-Israel politics and politicians have gotten much smarter, right? Much smarter about obscuring the ways that they want to maintain the U.S.-Israel relationship. This is going to become another discriminator to figure out, like, if somebody's actually serious, or if they're not.
So I have a one simple question and one complicated question. Let's do the complicated question first, which is, I think a lot of, or to some degree, what could help overcome this, and what you're doing is part of the work, is making sure that people understand what these folks did, and make sure that that stays in the public eye and that people are aware of it, as these staffing decisions are getting made, going into 2028, or as people are looking for advisors, like, just to keep it in the front of people's minds. The other thing that I think is needed on the, non, Anthony Blinken way of the Democratic Party, is some institutional support. Like, you have places like CAP that are happy to welcome Anthony Blinken and John Feiner back to their board. And you've got Harvard as an institution, the Kennedy School, which will give Jake Sullivan the Henry Kissinger professorship of massacring people in the third world somewhere, or you've got the CSIS or any of these think tanks really that exist to keep people in stasis in between democratic administrations, and then they get to go back. That feels like something that's not isn't at the point it needs to be at for, let's say, the non-interventionist or the restraint oriented, or the whatever term you want to use for that part of the foreign policy community, or the Democratic Party, kind of intellectual base. And so you don't have necessarily these places that are obvious. If I'm a candidate and I'm looking for some help on foreign policy, where am I going to go to? Well, I'll just go to CAP and ask them who they've got. Like it feels like this is something that's needed, and yet at the same time, I don't know where the money, especially now, comes from for this kind of stuff, or to stand it up for that group.
Derek, I think you answered your own question there a little bit, right? Like,
Sadly, yes.
Raytheon's not going to give $250,000 to an anti-war think tank. The government of the United Arab Emirates is not going to give millions of dollars to an anti-war, anti-Middle East intervention think tank. And I shout them out because I was surprised to discover that what I thought was a fairly good Middle East focused think tank called Middle East Institute is like 99% funded by the UAE
Yeah.
government. And so
speaking of which, if anybody at the UAE wants to, get on the phone with us, we're open for business.
So like, right, the money is obviously not going to be there to the same degree. That being said, like, for what it's worth, we are working on this, right? That's a problem that I'd say folks in my community have identified. I think as we get closer to the election, you will see efforts to build like hypothetical benches, or just to build an actual bench of reliable, progressive NatSec professionals. Because what I can say right now definitively is these people do exist, and I know they exist because if you work in any agency or you go on the Hill, you see there's a bunch of people who are real smart and have good politics and just have not been empowered to be in charge of anything. So the people are out there. I'm calling a lot of shots on this podcast today, but I can say that you are going to see some rosters, some bench building going on our side leading up to the election. But yeah, like for very obvious reasons, we are not going to have the same money behind us, and it's something that, like, I lament. Like, the job, I work for an organization called Win Without War, where I do progressive foreign policy advocacy. There's just not that many jobs like that in DC. There's demand. It's not because we don't need more people doing what I do, but it's just because there's unfortunately a lot less donor money in peace.
Maybe as a final question, because this isn't as substantive, but it's infuriating. We could talk about you mentioned in your piece, and there was this uh, event, I guess, a few days ago, like a couple of weeks ago, maybe, where or last week perhaps, where I think John Feiner was
Yeah.
on a panel and got asked about your piece, I think, and had a response about the mistakes that they made, and got the oopsies that they made in Gaza.
John, not
How
so fine.
Yeah, like how
You're
are these
welcome.
people lamely trying to
Yeah.
kind of shed responsibility, or grudgingly admit some kind of vague error with Gaza, without obviously accepting any real responsibility, or acknowledging that
I
what they did was criminally, morally repugnant. Maybe you could just kind of talk a little bit about that.
and I mean, they must be aware that, um people are thinking differently, that this might actually be a stain in a way
They
that
have to
Iraq
be.
wasn't, right? They
Yeah, I mean,
have to be aware of
Cap put
this.
on an event that Blinken was gonna be at on a panel, and they didn't advertise him. He's on the board of the organization, and they couldn't advertise him because they knew that people would come and protest if they knew he was gonna be there. So, yeah, I mean, they're definitely
Yeah.
aware of it.
I think there'll be a slow shedding actually, sorry, Harrison. I think that's what's actually going to happen is that between now and 2028, there's gonna be a slow shedding. I mean, I personally think someone like Newsom has very little shot. I think that Buttigieg I think I just don't know what's going to happen because it also does seem like it'll be difficult for AOC. But I think there's going to be a slow shedding of a lot of these people. I think it's going to be too much. And I think the Democratic Party is going to have turned against Israel. At least the support of Israel that has defined it. It depends what you mean by turn against. So let me clarify that. But I think there's actually little future for the big names here. I think it's going to be tough. Personally, maybe I'm being naive, particularly given the history of U.S. foreign policy in the last generation. But it just seems like this one, a line was crossed. Too much was broadcast. There's been too big a shift in opinion, but I might be wrong.
Well, first, Danny, I hope you're right, and then I can basically retire. But Derek, yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it's worth breaking down like the post Biden administration arguments. You have some guys, God bless them, like really Blinken and McGurk, who are basically it's pretty clear that they don't even feel a need to. They don't feel like they did anything wrong. They don't feel like they need to really admit to anything. Um, and they're just kind of cruising on. I would say Jake Sullivan is also pretty much in that camp where he said repeatedly like, well, it's sad that a bunch of Palestinians died. I wouldn't have done anything differently. But that's unfortunate. And then when he finally, one turning point amongst Dems was about summer 2025 when y'all may remember, like the Trump quote unquote ceasefire broke down and Netanyahu just started like as completely as possibly starving Gaza to death, and then mainstream Dems got a little more comfortable speaking out about Israel. So when that happened, Jake Sullivan said, "Well, actually, now I think we should condition weapon sales to Israel, but with no no not reconsidering his arguments up until then that we should give unconditional support to Israel." So he still didn't say I was wrong. He said, well, now that Trump and Netanyahu have done this, it's time to shift. And that's the closest we got for an apology from him. And then you go to John Feiner, Sullivan's deputy, and Phil Gordon, Kamala Harris's top national security advisor, who write a piece around the same time also saying, hey, it's time to condition weapons to Israel, and sort of tepidly saying, I don't think Biden did things right. I actually don't think Biden did the best job possible. And that's a sentiment that they've repeated, but that's about as far as they've gone. And so I think like that's the sentiment that's really worth addressing is this like criticism of Biden when you're almost a year after the election, and what to make of that. And I would say like a few things can be true. These guys probably genuinely do feel guilty about what they did, and that's totally irrelevant in my estimation. They feel guilty about what they did, but they have demonstrated both in and out of office that they lack the courage to do anything about it until it feels very safe. And so that means whatever's in your heart, the next time you get served up a genocide or you get served up an opportunity to do war crimes, which if you're running the U.S. empire, there's going to be a lot of opportunities for that. You're still going to be too scared to do the right thing. So I don't really care that you can do kind of the Biden official version of a shoot and cry uh, when we're getting to like September of 2025 and say like, well, actually Biden didn't do the best job possible. And the other reason we should doubt the sincerity of these folks is, as I write in the article, is like, well, Joe Biden was famously like barely cognizant, and it was this group of advisors who had an incredibly powerful role running this policy. And so, do you have anything to tell us about them? Did they make bad decisions? Should they be recycled back into politics, or you're going to protect them? It's like, okay, well then you doubly can't be trusted to return to politics. And the last thing actually I'll add is, even the folks who've expressed, some regret, nobody has apologized for lying. Nobody has acknowledged that they lied or that they helped their boss lie. And I think that's something even people who don't particularly care about the Middle East or Gaza, if you just have some sort of very old school, like, you watch The West Wing and those are your principles, it should also be upsetting that, Blinken, Sullivan, Feiner all lied about, like, we're about to turn the corner for a ceasefire in summer of 2024, where we know now that was just totally untrue. You have the people who supported Kamala Harris in her campaign, which included, of course, the working tirelessly for a ceasefire at the Dem convention, included some very belligerent language against Iran that I still don't understand why she said that. And, like, these folks are not even willing to admit, hey, by the way, that obvious lie that we did, we want you to know that we're sorry for that, or that we did lie. But no, we're just kind of expected to ignore that ever happened. So, like, separate from their policy choices, which some people may want to, like, really look at analytically, a lot of these folks just went on TV and lied, or wrote speeches for their bosses so they could go on TV and lie. And, like, that should be a red line, especially if we're trying to be the party that's a little bit different from Donald Trump.
One thing I do want to say, I think we're closing out here, is that Jan Moorfield, the political theorist, wrote a great book called Empires Without Imperialism, Anglo-American Decline in the Politics of Deflection. And one of her arguments is that this feeling of guilt is actually constitutive of modern liberal foreign policy, and that it's basically a way to keep on doing bad things, but you're still good and righteous because you feel guilty about it. And there's this notion of tragic necessity. And I think that we're seeing that here, and we've got to move beyond that. Otherwise, we're just going to get more Iraqs and more Gazas.
Absolutely. And it's an excuse to avoid accountability, is like some very tepid expressions of guilt. And I just want to add one more thing about why I think it's important not just to exclude these folks, or, I write in the article, ideally prosecute them, but I'm not that hopeful about that. To exclude these folks and some of the top lieutenants under them is, like, it's not just about, like, punishing these individuals. It's not just about the fact that a lot of them have demonstrated that they might do the same thing again if given the chance. It's that, ideally, you know, we want that next number three at the State Department, when they're confronted with this situation, to be much more afraid of the consequences of breaking the law than they are of, contradicting their boss. And that's not where we're at. That's a kind of idealistic goal, but there's an incentive structure that is just totally imbalanced. And one of the reasons accountability is important is to try and get us to a place where doing war crimes is actually self-interested people don't want to do.
Yeah, that's the dream. That self-interested people wouldn't want to do war crimes. I mean, it's the lowest possible bar, and we can't manage to hit it. But I think on that note, we'll end it here. Harrison, thank you so much. Win Without War, Zateo. We'll have links to all the relevant things in the show description. But we really do appreciate you coming back.
Thanks, guys.